Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, the SNP government claimed that their so-called non-profit distributing model took the profit motive and the shareholder dividend out of the building and running of public infrastructure projects in Scotland. But this week's Audit Scotland and Accounts Commission report blows a hole in that claim. First Minister, do you accept their conclusions or are you in denial?
First Minister.
Do you know, when I was thinking about what Richard Leonard might ask me about today, I thought he won't really go on PFI, will he? But he has, and who am I to complain? So let me firstly give the background. We use the non-profit distributing model because if we hadn't done that, because of the £6 billion cumulative cut to our capital budget imposed by the Tories, we wouldn't have been able to build the 117 schools, the hospitals and the other public sector buildings. We did that through a system where we made improvements on Labour's PFI, so profit capping. Under Labour's PFI, if surpluses were made, do you know where they went? They went into the pockets of investors. Under our system, surpluses got reinvested into the public sector. Under Labour PFI projects, the repayments under Labour's projects amount, because they're still being paid, to 5.5 times the capital value of the projects. We got that down to just 3.5 times. So we made the improvements that Labour didn't make. And I can't believe that Richard Leonard has got the brass neck to stand up here and talk about PFI.
Richard Leonard.
Well, Presiding Officer, I anticipated last night how the First Minister might respond to my first question. So I went back to look at a report which I wrote 25 years ago, and here is an extract from it. Here's the report. The PFI is something of a con trick, predicated on a buy now, pay later mirage. It is a mirage because the taxpayer or the user will simply pay more in the end. It is smart accountancy, but bad economics. The fact is that government can always borrow at a lower interest rate than the private sector. So I have been consistent on this question, has the First Minister. The Accounts Commission this week conclude that the Scottish Government have failed to properly monitor and evaluate billions of pounds worth of privately financed contracts.
Mr. Leonard, just hold on 1 second. That's an unacceptable level of noise. I'm sorry, but we should treat each other with respect in this chamber. Please listen to the questions being put and then answer them in a respectful way and less of this barracking. Mr. Leonard.
The Accounts Commission conclude that without proper transparency and accountability, the risks increased and the costs have skyrocketed. We pay 3 times the capital value of assets in unitary charges alone. It is what the Accounts Commission described this week as, and I quote them, the private finance cost premium. First Minister, why for the last 13 years have you presided over this rip-off?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, on capital value, Richard Leonard says NPD projects cost 3 times the capital value. That's a vast improvement on the 5.5 times the capital value under Labour schemes. On transparency, under the old Labour-supported schemes, you used to have to wait after 25 years after the asset was complete before you got the information about it. We now publish most of that material 2 years after an asset is complete, so much greater transparency. But Richard Leonard, wrote a report 25 years ago. Isn't it a real shame that the Labour governments who followed in the years after that ignored everything Richard Leonard said, and it took an SNP government to act on the things that he said, capping taxing the profits on the projects, making sure that surpluses go back into the public sector, not into the pockets of investors like Labour used to allow to happen. And my last point, presiding officer, and I will be brief, sorry, I maybe am enjoying myself too much here, but I will be brief. Richard Leonard says, rightly, public borrowing would be cheaper. Yes, of course, but we didn't have the power to borrow publicly because Labour preferred those powers to stay with the Tories at Westminster than have them here in the Scottish Parliament. So if that is belated support for increasing the borrowing powers of this Parliament, then maybe we've made some progress after all today.
Richard Leonard.
We are in favour of increasing the borrowing powers of this Parliament, and we are against PFI, NPD and all its successor bodies. But I'll tell you this, instead of using this Parliament to speak to your party about a divisive referendum which the people don't want and obsessing about a flag, never mind the symbolism of a flag, let's look at the symbolism of a sick kids' hospital in this city. A hospital that will not open for over a year, but which is costing £1.4 million a month in charges, which proves, as this week's report by Audit Scotland shows, that with your finance model, we have a transfer of reward to the private sector, but no transfer of risk. Yes. First Minister, this week has shown that you have got the wrong priorities. Tomorrow you are speaking to your party faithful. So today, why don't you speak to the patients, to the families, to the staff who are being let down in this city? Why don't you take this opportunity to focus on their priorities?
First Minister.
I think Richard Leonard should just be relieved that tomorrow he's not speaking to his party faithful, because they would be in utter despair based on what we have just heard. You know, we used the non-profit distributing model because the Tories cut over the decade we've just had. They've taken £6 billion cumulatively out of our capital budgets, and we didn't have borrowing powers. In the last couple of years, we've got very, very limited borrowing powers, which we're using to the full. But Labour, of course, didn't support borrowing powers coming to this Parliament. So instead of continuing to use PFI, instead of continuing to use the PFI that was such a bad deal for taxpayers and the public that Labour favoured, we introduced a new scheme that capped the profits while transferring risk, that didn't allow surpluses to go to investors and reduced the overall costs to the taxpayer. That's what we did after Labour, for all these years, presided over the PFI scandal. So I think Richard Leonard, notwithstanding what he wrote 25 years ago, should have a long, hard look at Labour on this issue before he comes to the SNP.